Chapter 6. After yet another miserably hot and sleepless night, Selena spent the following day with Sam, walking through the streets of Skulls Bay. They kept their pace leisurely, pausing at various vendors' carts and popping into the occasional shop, but all the while tracing each step of their plan, going over every detail that they'd need to orchestrate perfectly. From the fishermen along the docks, they learned that the rowboats tied to the piers belonged to nobody in particular, and that tomorrow's morning tide came in just after sunrise. Not advantageous, but better than midday. From flirting with the harlots along the main street, Sam learned that every once in a while, Rolf covered the tab for all the pirates in his service, and the revelry lasted for days. Sam also picked up a few other pointers that he refused to tell Selena about. And from the half-drunk pirate languishing in an alley, Selena learned how many men guarded the slave ships, what manner of weapons they carried, and where the slaves were kept. When 4 o'clock rolled around, Selena and Sam were standing aboard the ship Rolf had promised them, watching and counting as the slaves stumbled onto the wide deck. 93. Mostly men, most of them young. The women were a broader range of ages, and there were only a handful of children, just as Rolf had said.
"Do they meet your refined tastes?"
Rolf asked as he approached.
"I thought you said there'd be more,"
she replied coldly, keeping her eyes upon the chained slaves.
"We had an even 100, but 7 died on the journey."
She bit back the anger that flared. Sam, knowing her far too well for her liking, cut in.
"And how many can we expect to lose on the journey to Rifthold?"
His face was relatively neutral, though his brown eyes flashed with annoyance. Fine. He was a good liar. As good as she was, maybe. Rolf ran a hand through his dark hair.
"Don't you two ever stop questioning? There's no way of predicting how many slaves you'll lose. Just keep them watered and fed."
A low growl slipped through her teeth, but Rolf was already walking to his group of guards. Selena and Sam followed him, observing as the last of the slaves were shoved onto the deck.
"Where are the slaves from yesterday?"
Sam asked. Rolf waved a hand.
"Most are on that ship, and will leave tomorrow."
He pointed to a nearby ship and ordered one of the slave drivers to start the inspection. They waited until a few slaves had been looked over, offering remarks on how fit a slave was, where he'd fetch a good price in Rifthold. Each word tasted fouler than the last.
"Tonight," she said to the pirate lord, "you can guarantee that this ship's protected?"
Rolf sighed loudly and nodded.
"That watchtower across the bay," she pressed. "I assume that they'll also be responsible for monitoring this ship, too?"
"Yes,"
Rolf snapped. Selena opened her mouth, but he interrupted.
"And before you ask, let me say that we changed the watch just before dawn."
So they'd have to target the morning watch instead, to avoid any alarm being raised at dawn, at high tide. Which was a slight hitch in her plan, but they could easily fix it.
"How many of the slaves speak our language?" she asked.
Rolf raised a brow.
"Why?"
She could feel Sam tense beside her, but she shrugged.
"It might add to their value."
Rolf studied her a bit too closely, then whirled to face a slave woman standing nearby.
"Do you speak the common tongue?"
She looked this way and that, clutching her scraps of clothing to her. A mix of fur and wool, undoubtedly worn to keep her warm in the frigid mountain passes of the White Fangs.
"Do you understand what I'm saying?"
Rolf demanded. The woman lifted her shackled hands. Raw, red skin lay around the iron.
"I think the answer is no,"
Sam offered. Rolf glared at him, then walked through the stables.
"Can any of you speak the common tongue?"
He repeated himself, and was about to turn back when an older Eelway man, reed-thin and covered with cuts and bruises, stepped forward.
"I can,"
he said.
"That's it?"
Rolf barked at the slaves.
"No one else?"
Selena approached the man who had spoken, committing his face to memory. He recoiled at her mask and her cloak.
Well, at least he might fetch a higher price,
Selena said over her shoulder to Rolf. Sam summoned Rolf with a question about the mountain woman in front of him, providing enough distraction.
"What's your name?"
Selena asked the slave.
Dia.
His long, frail fingers trembled slightly.
"You're fluent?"
He nodded.
My mother was from Belhaven. My father was a merchant from Benjali. I grew up with both languages."
And he'd probably never worked a day in his life. How had he gotten caught up in this mess? The other slaves on the deck hung back, huddling together. Even some of the larger men and women whose scars and bruises marked them as fighters, prisoners of war. Had they already seen enough of slavery to break them? For both her sake and theirs. She hoped not.
"Good,"
she said, and strode away. Hours later, no one noticed, or if they did, they certainly didn't care, when two cloaked figures slipped into two rowboats and headed toward the slave ships hovering several hundred yards offshore. A few lanterns illuminated the behemoth vessels, but the moon was bright enough for Selena to easily make out the Golden Wolf as she rowed toward it. To her right, Sam rowed as quietly as he could to the Loveless, where the slaves from yesterday were being held. Silence was their only hope and ally, though the town behind them was already in the midst of revelry. It hadn't taken long for word to get out that Arab and Hommel's assassins had opened a celebratory tab at the tavern, and even as they had strode to the docks, pirates were already streaming the other way toward the inn. Panting through her mask, Selena's arms ached with each stroke. It wasn't the town she was worried about, but the solitary watchtower to her left. A fire burned in its jagged turret, faintly illuminating the catapults and the ancient chain across the narrow bay mouth. If they were to be caught, the first alarm would be sounded from there. It might have been easier to escape now, take down the watchtower, overpower the slave ships, and set sail. But the chain was only the first in a line of defenses. The dead islands were nearly impossible to navigate at night, and at low tide, they'd get a few miles and run aground on a reef or a sandbank. Selena drifted the last few feet to the Golden Wolf and grasped the rung of a wooden ladder to keep the boat from thudding too hard against the hull. They were better off at first light tomorrow, when the pirates would be too drunk or unconscious to notice, and when they had high tide on their side. Sam flashed a compact mirror, indicating he'd made it to the Loveless. Catching the light in her own mirror, she signaled him back, then flashed twice, indicating that she was ready. A moment later, Sam returned the same signal. Selena took a long, steadying breath. It was time.